Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I'm Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson with a mouthful of food. Sorry.
And today we're talking about fighting. It's episode 34, The Fight Show, how to argue at work without being an asshole. So, for example, if I had said to Eugene right before we're about to record a podcast as he is stuffing food into his mouth.
Yeah. Well, you know, somebody called one of my references and they go, what kind of management style works best with Eugene? And this is being reported to me by the person who was asked. And he paused and goes, creative. I said, hey, man, that's going to not get me the job. That's loaded. He goes, but it's true. I go, okay, whatever.
Well, and those of you who are Eugene fans, and I know many listeners are, you know that he's written a book about fighting. He has a podcast about mixed martial arts, talks about fighting, and has himself a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So we are not talking about physical fighting. Actual grappling is not involved in our conversation today. What we're going to, that he's showing, for those of you that are listening, he is brandishing the black belt, wrapping it around.
Yeah, you know, if you have it, you understand it. If you don't have it, well, who cares? Anyway, sorry.
But what we do want to talk about is conflict at work. And, you know, it's a subject that we've talked about before. We've talked about feuds, simmering resentments. That's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about arguing or fighting, the kind of conflict that erupts at work and how to best handle it. Eugene, do you have any non-physical work fight stories?
You know I do. I don't have, I got stories from the kids' schoolyard, parent teachers meetings. I had one yesterday where I'm sitting three places at a table, 3 placemats at a table, and I'm sitting at one. The other 2 people have gone out to get some more food. There's a table next to me that has bunches of chairs. Some guy comes over and attempts to take one of the chairs. And I said, hey, what are you doing? And the guy goes, I'm taking one of these chairs. I go, you know what? You seem like a pretty smart guy. What do you think is happening here? He goes, oh, I'm tripping. But, you know, you don't have to be so hostile about it. You know, so this follows me my entire life. And I've had from bosses, managers slamming down books on my hands as I'm writing, and, you know, having asked me to do something, I said, give me 5 minutes, I'll do it, and slammed a phone book on my hand as I'm writing and said, do it now, to a boss that I had, or to a guy I was on a dotted line with, where it got kind of heated over going home for Christmas. And we argued over something. I go, my manager didn't say to do this. I'm telling you to do it. And I go, I'm not doing it. And what are you going to do? Beat me up? And there was a second there. There was a moment there where I could see that he was genuinely considering it. Like, this is madness. So, yeah, I've been involved in a lot of these. And what usually bugs people out is that they believe it's uncharacteristic, but those who know me know it's not, that I managed to be really level-headed about it and calm. And this comes from having a mom who is a long time, you know, counselor. I mean, that's what she did for the majority of her career, usually with at-risk youth. So I've learned coping mechanisms to deal with people who are about to lose it. So,
well, and that brings us to the first point, because what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about how I would discuss this if I were in a training or if in an executive coaching session, right? And I actually do an entire training about conflict at work. And one of the things that I like to start with is to reframe the narrative, because a lot of people think conflict is bad. It's a sign of a breakdown. And there are a lot of people in our culture that are very, very conflict avoidant, right? Second generation Italian. I don't happen to be one of those people, but a lot of people are. And in fact, my fight stories, I've had a couple of coworkers and in one case, a boss, both of them from New York City. And we would argue frequently. And we had a lot of affection for each other. I mean, one of the women is like my best friend these many years later. But people around us, because we were in Seattle, which is very kind of a passive aggressive vibe generally, would get so agitated that we had to go outside to have even a heated conversation, right? So, but for us, in both of those relationships, conflict was, nobody was afraid of it. It was a way to air differences. The idea was to come to some sort of a solution, and we had a respect for each other. So I just want to start by that. Like conflict is not bad. It actually can be really positive. But the first thing I always say to people is exactly what you said is your first response in a conflict situation is for you to regulate your own emotion.
Right.
And the way that I suggest to do that is to think of the word pause. Don't do anything. Don't write an email. Don't write a Slack. Don't say anything. If you need to physically get up and move, that can be really useful. If you're working at home, say, I'm going to have to get back to you, walk around the block, vent to someone who's not at work. But the idea is your first responsibility is to get to more of an even keel before you can do anything else, right? Rarely do we regret the thing we did not send or text.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think if I've ever, and you have an actor, and this seems to be breaking down along the lines of actor and the acted upon. And I have never, and I'm sure people who I've worked with, in the comments, I'm happy to have you dispute this, but I, as in my time as a boss, have never flown off the handle at somebody. And I'm not even going to add the proviso who didn't deserve it. I generally tend to be, because there are differentiations when you're having conflicts between, this is America, I'm an African-American man, I have to regulate. If the dotted line person I'm talking to or my boss is a smaller man, I have to, I have to be okay. I can't have people walking through the workplace making claims that they are intimidated by me. I can't be overly emotional. That's not accessible to me. And I know those are like, oh, you sure you can? No, I choose not to. I don't want to walk through the world like that, and certainly not if I've got women dotted line or people who are reporting to me or who I report to. I don't. That's just not. It's not effective. I don't do it in my relationships even. So, yeah, I do it with strangers. but in general, I think these are this is multi-level chess, and you have to be. Yeah, you should. I like that you're willing to engage in conflict, but for me, I understand that it's a minefield of negative possibilities. So,
well, and you bring up the idea of race. There's also differences often I see in terms of gender.
yeah.
I am the unusual woman who is not afraid of conflict. A lot of times women who are faced with anger or who are feeling upset or distressed or attacked will often cry, even though they are angry. And they have all sorts of narratives around, should you cry at work? Should you not? Other people have narratives. There are a lot of people who can't respond in the moment, right? They maybe need to think about something. So you're right. There's a complexity to when we talk about regulating emotions in the moment. It can be deeply complex, especially for people who have trauma. And that trauma might be their own personal trauma. It might be intergenerational trauma. So yes, for sure, complexity. But I think the second thing to try to do is to be, if you can, strategic. Right? So you have a conflict with someone who works in another office building who happened to have some sort of unpleasant interaction with you. How important is it that you address that conflict? Right? And I think some of the criteria that I look at in terms of, should I engage with this person? Should I try to have an argument or address what's happened? The first thing is to look at how important is this person to me? Right? If it's some jerk in another building who is like rude to you in the cafeteria and you don't ever have to work with him, he has no power over anything that you do. You may feel like, okay, now I can say whatever I want, or you may just like, I'm not even gonna. I don't need to mess with that. If it's someone who is on your team, if it's your boss, if it's like a key work partner, then I think you want to assess it.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm remembering this occasion where when I was working at Intel, which is cubicle land, because it's an egalitarian system and everybody has a cubicle as big as everybody. Okay, whatever. So I'm there, and they were putting in a new computer, and the guy rolls up, has a computer on the cart, the systems guy, and he takes a look at me, and I was in, I don't know, maybe it was 32 then. Takes a look at me, and he makes a value call. He goes, yeah, well, if you could just pick it up and put it on your desk. And now I know you see, my time in the Screen Actor Guild has served me well because it's a union. So they're really narrowly defined what you can do, what you should do, what you would do, and what you're not going to get any benefit for if you don't do. And I look at the guy, I said, are you going to sit down and write this article for me? He goes, what? No. I go, that's why I'm not lifting the computer. I'll move out of the way so you can do it. And the guy looked, oh, what an ass. But you wouldn't have asked anybody else to do that, So I get hurt doing that. What do I get? I get nothing. So sorry, bud, you lift the computer. It's your job. But that was, again, the purview of somebody who we don't share our work spheres, did not interact except for this one moment. So,
well, and I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, because the way that I read that is you're setting a boundary.
Yeah.
And someone else has the opportunity to decide how they want to respond to what is clearly a reasonable boundary. I think with conflict, maybe the way to focus this is that both people are acting from good intention and they think what they're doing makes sense. Right. So it's not one person setting a boundary, another disagreeing, although that may be part of it. So here's an example when these are the reasons that I think you should engage directly when there's conflict at work. The first one is when there is abuse, right? Whether it's to you or someone who works for you, right? This is where, if you have privilege, it is your responsibility, I believe, to be an ally wherever you can. So the boss that decided it was a good idea to come up and rap you over the knuckles with a book, someone should have stood up and either gone straight to HR, depending on who that person was, or whipped out their camera and started filming and posted it on, like social media. So I do think we have a responsibility. Now, the caveat, since as those of you that have listened to us before understand, we're not big fans of human resources. So the person to go and call that stuff out to, especially if you are being abused by a person in power or a person who has power, is not always HR. It might be a sympathetic executive. It may need to be a lawyer, right? But that is one situation where you need to address something. I think the second one is, if the relationship is important to you and you feel like it has the capacity to repair, right? So the model that I always use is every relationship is going to have rupture. Yep. The issue is, can there be repair? Because relationships that have rupture and repair become stronger. You get that muscle memory. Oh, we can have a disagreement and we can sort it through and we can move on. And that actually can build trust. Right. So here's an example. If you have a boss who has never shown any capacity or interest in self-awareness, shows zero emotional intelligence, and continues to do the same objectionable behavior over and over again, even though he's been told about it by HR or other reports, there's no point in you going to him and addressing behavior.
Right.
Go look for another job or try to get transferred to another department. However, if you have a working relationship with someone who has shown the ability to listen, who has some emotional intelligence, then you can try actually addressing the conflict. Right? So you want to know how to have that conflict conversation?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Because I like systems. I like structures. And the first one is to pause again. So don't have the conversation until you have metabolized your more intense emotions, right? You need to be self-aware. And you also need to be self-aware about what is the fuel behind your emotion. Right. So for me, rarely is something just on the surface, right? So if a man disrespects me in a meeting, I am not just dealing with that moment of disrespect. I'm dealing with 30 years of sexual harassment. I'm dealing with, my complex grief about where my career would be if I was a white man instead of a white woman. And, I need to understand that about myself, right? Am I reacting in proportion to what's happened? So 1, do your own homework. 2, understand how you want to articulate your grievance and what you want, right? So for example, let's use the example of somebody cutting me off in a meeting. If I should go and be specific and I should be clear about what I want. So I might say something like, when you cut me off in that meeting and dismissed my concerns about the project, say I'm very specific. I was frustrated and hurt because as a team, we need to be able to air our concerns to avoid errors. Business case. It's not just how I feel. There's a business reason. Hang on, and then going forward, I need you to not interrupt me or dismiss my concerns. And I think you should acknowledge this in the next team meeting and give me an apology.
Okay, so in terms of if the issue is periodicity, I know you said you started out with you should think about this, compartmentalize, kind of come up with, regulate your emotions. Are you also what is it, spiritus d'escalier, the French thing about the thing that you remember afterward? What if you have the presence of mind to be able to deliver that at the time? Is it admissible to acknowledge what happened as it's happening?
Yes, but I think that there's a couple of you have to possess a couple of attributes. One, you have to have the self-awareness to understand if you have metabolized your emotions or if you have the emotional skill to act proportionally, which you may have done. You may have so much therapy behind you. You may meditate for an hour every morning. You may feel like I can actually address this in the moment. And then for those of you that don't speak French, what Eugene was referring to is that moment when you're walking away from an interaction and you're on the stairs and you remember the thing you wish you should have said, right? If you don't do that, if you can handle it in the moment, you can just recognize that, so the thing to keep in mind is that there's a brain science that we all have to deal with, right? And when we feel threatened, we go to a more primitive part of our brain, right? Our amygdala is going to take over and we're not going to be as rational, right? Some of us have an ability to navigate that. I sometimes, the more angry I am, the more articulate and clear I become. But most people don't have that, right? And you're often not going to do your best, most strategic thinking in the moment. But yeah, if you feel like you can do that, then, there's an advantage to it, especially for people who are conflict averse, who maybe need that head of steam to be able to say, hey, that's not okay.
I would maybe preface it with, I can understand taking this offline, but it seems to me that it's counter the spirit of good group politics for you to be dismissive of group opinions when that's what you asked for. But so you've made your point, but you've also given them an out to say, let's take it offline so we don't have to share this with the rest of the people. I recently had a problem with a manager over, and I'm not, excuse me for using the name that still stands in my head, over Twitter. And at a certain point, I gave the option. I said, I don't know if this is the right place for it. Let's we could pick up the phone. And he goes, this is a perfect place for it. So people got an uncomfortable window into the collapse of what is a 14-year relationship online live on Twitter. And then of course, the manager later, I was told that the guy is bipolar and his meds were wrong and he was having a problem, which then it being mentioned to me in that context kind of made it seem that it was my responsibility to understand that he was bipolar, that his meds were wrong, and that I should have been the bigger person and refused to engage in a public forum. But as it is, the company got sold. And so it was a discussion that didn't need to be followed up on. But it was a very strange attempt to be normal. And they're just dragged into the deep end. So,
well, and then that person gets to have the consequences of their choices. Right. If you have taken the higher road and said, do we want to engage in this conversation in this venue? And they proceed. But again, if you have the wherewithal to be able to address something, then you should. If you are the kind of person who has the wherewithal to address that for someone else and it's appropriate, then you can also do that. Right. And again, complexity. But I think in these conversations, there's two other points to keep in mind, and this is for every argument you ever have, right? One is to watch the global attacks. You always, you never. That just right there, again, what part of the brain are you engaging? You want to try to calm everything down for yourself and for the other person, and making those global statements. It is an attack. People are going to respond accordingly. And then the next one is really watch your narratives. Right? So we are meaning-making machines, and people make up stories in their heads. And often those narratives can be false, damaging, inaccurate, and incendiary. Right? I mean, just look at the news right now. Right? Look at the conversations, in all sorts of different places about protesters on college campuses. There are some narratives that you hear over and over again. And, just to be clear, a person can be Jewish and not support the choices of the government of Israel or their actions. And a person can protest what they perceive to be genocide without being anti-Semitic or supporting Hamas. And for a lot of people, as they heard that sentence, they engaged with it. They were activated. They had all sorts of stuff come up for them, because we're dealing with an issue, a situation, a part of the world, a political challenge that has deep roots in trauma on both sides that connect to other people's experiences of trauma. We are going to have an immediate rush of energy around that particular narrative. And you just need to be aware of that. Doesn't mean you can't have conversations. Doesn't mean you can't disagree. Just recognize oh, I'm in the red zone now. I have now moved into something that isn't about whether or not you can have a Thursday afternoon off. It's what are you going to do with that Thursday afternoon? And, what are your political beliefs behind that action?
Yeah, I had something strange. And this all presumes, of course, honest brokers, because I had a situation where my boss called me in. He had been at the Wall Street Journal, and I had no reason to suspect that he was an honest broker. He called me in, and he was sitting there with my direct line manager, and he said, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you about something." And I go, "Okay." And he said, "She feels threatened by you." And she goes, I didn't say that. And he goes, "No, you just did." So the kids would say he put her on Front Street. I don't think she expected him to do that. I don't think it was particularly welcome. I don't think it was how she spun it when she spun it to him. But, he did the old dad trick, was like, I'm going to create a situation where you guys solve your own difficulties before you get to me. And this is the way I'm going to do it. I don't think it was honest brokering. And I don't think it was particularly nice, because at that point I turned to her and I go, "In what way?" And she starts stuttering and muttering and just goes, I mean, at this point, I realized that she has been set up and that he was the one who set her up. And whatever discussion that they were having, it had more to do with those two. Both of them had come from the Wall Street Journal. So I just said, it's not my intent to intimidate anybody. And I have an open door policy. I welcome, you guys communicating with me in whatever way best suits you, whether it's text or email or face-to-face or Zoom or Slack. But in intimidation, you should feel free to speak to me about what you'd like to speak to me about. And then I looked at him like, "Don't ever do this to me again." And I excused myself and left the office. So honest brokers, that's, I think, the key, finding those people in the workplace that you can actually be sane with.
Right. And I think that, we could do a whole show on triangulation. And how the ways in which that was inappropriate. And so I'm going to put that aside. But I think that what I'm considering is, what do you do if you're with someone who is an honest broker, right? Who does have good intention, who wants to repair a ruptured relationship. So just a couple more quick things. Take breaks if you need to. There's nothing wrong in saying, "You know what, this is getting heated. I want to take a break. Let's catch up later this afternoon. Let's revisit this tomorrow." And it's like breaking up with someone. You don't need their permission. Right? You don't need their permission or approval to stop a conversation if you are feeling any kind of way, right? Or if things are getting heated. The other is, there's a couple of phrases that can be really useful. So again, if we're thinking about co-regulation, if we're recognizing that as human animals, we co-regulate each other, right? So like even on screens right now, Eugene, if I started yelling, if I got super agitated, even if I wasn't yelling at you, you would have physiological responses to that because we co-regulate. So something to think about is ways that you can kind of calm everything down is slow your voice down. I mean, just watch your tone. I am a big yeller. I have had people say to me, stop yelling. I'm like, I'm not yelling as I yell.
Right.
Watch your tone, watch your volume, and then also say things that are validating, right? So one of my favorites is, you may be right. I'm not saying you are right. I'm not agreeing with you. You may be right. Pigs may fly. You may be right. Then the other thing is to validate what you actually can acknowledge.
Right.
Like, I understand that it was really hard for your team to have to work all night last night. I get that. That sucks, right? It was. It is difficult to have to work all night. Whether that was your fault, that's another point. So validating where you can, it's actually become kind of a catchphrase with people who have worked for me. Validate, validate, validate. Right? The other person has an experience that is genuine. It's real. They're in distress. You can acknowledge their distress without necessarily acknowledging your culpability in many cases. And then I think it is useful to try to have some compassion, right? It's not your responsibility to, know in advance that someone has a physical or mental illness that you didn't know about. Like that's not, you're not a mind reader. But if someone does have, if they're suffering from a personal tragedy, if they have, something that's going on in their lives, we can try to be compassionate, right? Assume best intention. People have bad days. They don't do well when they're sick or they're grieving. And then I think understand, like, what is your part? I have been in many situations where I have looked at myself as the one who was acted upon and could do chapter and verse about how. Rarely, do we automatically look at what our part is. Right? So, for example, the boss example that we were using where a male boss cut off a woman when she was talking and discounted her. Okay, that's bad. That's on him. But if she lights up Slack, tells everyone in the company what a jerk he is, goes on social media and starts posting personal crap about him, that's her part, right? And so to be clear about, is there something that you could have done more skillfully? Because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where there was a conflict, whether at work or in my personal life, and the other person did something that on a scale of 1 to 10 was a solid 8. And I did something that was maybe a 2.5. And I have apologized for my 2.5 and been surprised that suddenly they're able to acknowledge their culpability. They might not admit that it's an 8, but I'm the one measuring, and they can acknowledge and apologize that. So again, what I'm trying to get to overall is understand that conflict can be productive. It can actually build trust and strength. Pick and choose who you trust enough to engage in conflict with, and try to have this idea of an energetic exchange and kind of co-regulation where you try to stay calm, you try to calm them by validating and taking breaks as needed. And then hopefully it can become something productive.
Yeah, I think that the word that kept coming up during this segment that I really like is co-regulation, because I had a situation where everybody was telling me that an executive member of my staff was a holy terror. And I'd be out of the office on sales calls or be doing something, interviewing somebody or another. And it was a classic case of a kiss up, kick down. This person, she was great with me. And I knew that her passion for what we were doing was incredibly high. So that means the standards would be really high. And I thought, they're just whining, right? One day I came back to the office early and she was sequestered in, somebody had turned in some copy that was substandard or some photo that wasn't working. And she was in her office screaming at the top of her lungs and ranting, throwing stuff against the wall. And I come in and the entire office is terrified. And then they look at me like, finally you caught her. And I kind of go into the office and she's surprised to see me, did not expect to see me there. And I don't think much of my father, but in this instance, I found myself channeling him. I stood there and I said, this has to stop. She's like, well, I go, can't happen again, can't happen anymore, needs to stop now. It's no way to treat a staff. It's no way to run an office. You can't do it. If you cannot do this in a way that best suits this job, you got to do it from home. You can't. You got to stop. And she's like, okay. You know I love this publication. I said, I know. You can't do this. And I left the office, and it never happened again. Somebody had to set a boundary. It was my job. I just didn't believe my staff about how crazy she was when I wasn't there. But she wasn't crazy. She was passionate about the publication, but it worked. We had a more cohesive, harmonious workplace after that. And the stuff that was driving her crazy didn't go away. But then she would just come to me and say, look, these idiots. I go, oh, yeah, I got you. Let me talk to them. So.
But I think this is important and good to call out, is that your skill, even though you aren't a big fan of conflict, your skill in saying, I am a leader. I need to address this situation. I need to set a very, very clear boundary that this is unacceptable. Right. Worked. I can't imagine the relief of everybody else in that staff room, including the person that she was yelling and screaming and throwing things about. Yeah, and I think that comes back to it, is like what I've been talking about today is a lot of interpersonal kind of peer-to-peer. But the idea of a leader, and I think if you are in executive leadership or you do have teams, to recognize that you will set the tone and you will be the one responsible for setting and enforcing boundaries around how people treat each other. And it can make a big difference.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
That's what we've got.
Yep.
And two things. If you want to send us some questions, we do have a little advice podcast called Sub Rosa. It's WTF@badbossbrief.com. And I have been asked to ask you to subscribe. Some of you listen to us on YouTube, subscribe there. Some of you it's Substack, subscribe there. It's available for free everywhere. Subscribing does not entail money. Although if you want to throw some filthy lucre our way, we are always appreciative, because this
no amount of money is too small. It should be, well, I can only give $1. That's enough.
That is enough. That is enough. All right. And we will see you later. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief, and every single week for our Sub Rosa shorts, so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole.